In this video, I want to describe how to use a Sloyd knife and a hook knife or spoon knife to actually carve your spoon, okay? This is kind of a continuation of some of my other videos where I describe how to orient the spoon inside of the piece of wood and how we can create predictability to make making these cuts a lot easier. So if you haven't seen that, I'd recommend going back and taking a look at it. But this will give you kind of a base of some of the different grips and techniques for actually using these tools to create your spoon. So I'm talking about a Sloyd knife. If you're unfamiliar with the Sloyd knife, looks basically like so. Popular models are like the Mora, the 106, or the 120. Those are the two that I would recommend. This is similar, it's just one that I made, but you can see it has a fairly substantial blade, and then it has this very, very flat, razor sharp cutting edge. And having a really flat edge here is important, and having a long flat edge is important as well, because it allows that blade to actually register and run along the cut as you're making it. So the cut that you've just made, the tool is going to register against that, and that's going to create predictability. It's going to allow you to move smoothly through your cuts and create nice flat planes. Okay, so this is the Sloyd knife. It also has a little bit of a belly to it, kind of a curved back here. And this is valuable too for some kind of cuts where you're rotating a little bit. And oftentimes in end grain, that's helpful, where you can kind of slide through the cut rather than just push through it. Okay, so that's our Sloyd knife. A hook knife, the one I recommend for beginners is a Mora 164. Looks like so. Has a fairly tight curve here. Okay. You can see the cutting edge over here, which is nice and polished. This is a good one to start with. It's fairly easy to use, it's well made. You can get into tighter spaces because it's more of a compound curve versus what would be called an open sweep. This is more of an open sweep. It's a little compound as well. But you can imagine in a smaller bowl, like a baby spoon or something like that, this is not going to be effective. So the Mora is a really versatile tool, and it's not very expensive. So I really recommend starting out with that. And if you are using our Creative Carryout package, that's what you're going to be using. So typically I begin by using my Sloyd knife rather than the hook knife. You can do it the opposite way. It doesn't really matter too much. I'm going to start just with the handle here. I have a piece of walnut. We've oriented it so that all these cuts are predictable. So on the top side, we're descending towards the bowl. And oftentimes what I'll do is, for beginners, I'll actually draw the direction that you're going to make cuts onto the spoon. So here's our blank. You can see the shape of it here. On the front, we're going down this way. Okay. Cuts in the bowl are going to go this way. On the back side, it's exactly the opposite. So from kind of the high point, see how this is widest here, the high point, we're going to go in this direction. And here we're going to go down this way. And then on the sides, it's predictable in both directions. This is why we've created this larger point here and the narrower point down here. We're going to move from the top down in this direction, okay? So these cuts are going towards the bowl. And this is what you're going to encounter if you have nice straight grain and the piece is oriented properly. But you can't always count on this, even if you have done everything right. Sometimes you're going to be switching direction. There might be just some imperfection in the wood or whatever. So if you're running into trouble, flip the spoon around and try making a cut in the opposite direction. Okay. So in using your Sloyd knife to shape the handle, generally your grip, you're going to hold the tool like so. Blade is kind of facing your knuckles there. Oftentimes you do kind of choke up a little bit, but of course be careful of your fingers here. Sometimes I will hold it in the opposite direction and kind of make shallower cuts, and I'll show you what that looks like as well. So if you were in Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or whatever, you might know that you're never supposed to cut towards yourself. Okay. In carving, oftentimes it really is the opposite, but kind of the caveat here is that although you may be carving towards yourself, you're never carving towards the hand which is holding the blank. So what I mean here is there's a lot of times when I'm going to make a cut, and you can see I'm going to pull towards myself, like so. But the hand that's supporting the workpiece is out here. It's not down here. If I slip, I'm going to just cut right into my hand, okay? So it's always going to be out here, moving this direction. You can see as I'm making this cut as well, I have my elbow kind of tucked in. If I were to have my elbow swung way out like this, this would allow me to potentially even cut into my body. But with the elbow close to your chest, you really can't pull your arm past this point. So this creates kind of a predictable, safe cut. Okay. So making these cuts, and these cuts towards myself are really the ones that I use the most. They're easy to control. And you can get a lot of power with them too. Oftentimes if I'm carving, and certainly if I'm carving a lot, I'll use kind of a carving bib. Some of you guys might be familiar with this. I have a few homemade ones here. This is just a piece of leather on a string. But if you're bracing and using a lot of force here, it's helpful just to provide a little bit of padding here. You could use an apron, you could use whatever. But I'm just going to go ahead and use this. So in making these cuts on the sides of the handle here, coming towards myself, okay, whereas on the back side it's going the opposite way. So making this cut, I brace it, my hand's out of the way. If I have my fingers, pulled back beyond the edge, kind of back past here, I can start this cut all the way at the edge and proceed down through. I'm going to just start shaping kind of in the middle to show you what this stroke looks like. I'm just pulling down this way. And making the cut, you can see how and where I'm starting to cut here. I usually do a little bit of a modified version here, and you can see even when I started out there, I was doing it. And what I do is I support and I power the cut through using my non-dominant hand. For me, that's my left hand. So what I do a lot is I use these fingers to actually provide a lot of the power. So this creates a lot of predictability. Here I don't have quite so much control, and there's a tendency for me to fall back and hit into the bowl of the spoon here. But having these fingers here to support it and actually push through the cut allows me to just stop right kind of on a dime there, just by stopping that motion with my non-dominant hand. So I would do this on both sides as I move down into the bowl here, and I do it on the top side. So oftentimes I do try to establish nice flat planes on all four sides before I start to kind of bevel the edges, provide some facets. But I oftentimes use a spoon mule, which allows me to use a draw knife, which you could do even with a vise. But I have a lot of power there, so it's not particularly challenging for me to cut through a big, wide, flat plane. But up here, and I did make these a little bit oversized for the demonstration and for beginners, but cutting through this big, wide 1-inch plane with the knife flat like this, it takes a lot of power and it's not really very efficient carving. So on the top side of the spoon here, it's going towards the bowl, so are the sides. So if you're working just with your Sloyd knife, oftentimes you'll come up, and it's a little hard to see, you'll be working, let's see, right there, coming down the corner. Okay, so with that you can start to, you're cutting less material. You can peel right through. Here you can see I'm kind of sneaking up with my hand to provide that support, because the last thing I want to do is take this cut and blast it right into the side of the bowl there. There we're going to catch the grain, and nicking it will even sometimes produce just a very minor crack that's going to show up later in the process. So typically I'm going to, with the Sloyd knife, do the bevel, front, here, like so. Now I've drastically reduced the size of this top plane, and I can start to carve more effectively. Or rather, got a little bit of squirrely grain here, so I'm just going to remove that. And that's the thing about the wood. It's going to be unpredictable. It's one of the nice qualities of wood is that it provides something to you that you have to kind of react against. So you're going to encounter that, and you may have to switch around a little bit. On the back side, I would consider also knocking down these corners, but here you're not going to be coming towards the bowl. You're going to go the opposite way. So here too, I like to brace against my tummy, and I should be able to come down here, but we may need to switch around. Okay, so again, just using those fingers to lever it through. Grain switches direction a little bit here. So still, I'm just using one grip. I can slide through like so, and I freed up these little bits. But I can use a different grip. So this is called a thumb lever grip. So what I do with this, again, I'm not using my hand just to whittle it. I'm using my non-dominant hand to provide a little bit of support. So you can see here, what I've got going on is I'm pivoting using my thumb on the non-dominant hand. And you can see kind of the motion of my body here, kind of flapping my wings a little bit and working it through like so, and cutting through, okay? So rotating like so. You can see this stroke is kind of a smaller stroke, but I can take it and keep moving through the piece. There I'm taking a little bit too much material, so it starts to kind of split, so I'm just sneaking back up on it, okay? Maybe kind of a different angle here. So this is handy right here at the end of the workpiece in particular, because I can fly that cut right off into space, right? If I was trying to make this cut by bracing against my body, I'd be coming right into my bib here. The other place where I use this cut a lot is out in the bowl here. So from kind of the widest point of the bowl, we're going to be pivoting out and cutting like so. Okay. So there is kind of a coarser version of that grip, and it might just be obvious, it's kind of your whittle grip, where you are just holding the spoon and working against it. So here I'm just knocking it off. But you can see I don't have a lot of control with this grip. So it's not something I want to do when I'm, really defining the shape of the spoon. It's okay when you have to remove a lot of material. It's good sometimes in the handle here, probably particularly here. Just rip right through it. Back of the bowl, this is good. But you can imagine on the top side of the bowl, I wouldn't want to do this because, again, I'm smacking into the bowl of the spoon. Okay. There's a little bit of a modification of this grip, and this is a chest lever grip, and it's really useful. There's a lot of times you might use it. It's maybe a little bit harder to get the hang of. I don't use it as much as probably I should, but it's a powerful grip, and you have control with it as well. And with this grip, you're going to reorient the knife so that it's facing into your hand. Okay, so with this, you're actually, kind of using your chest and spreading your arms again in that kind of chicken wing flap. Okay, so you bring it in here and kind of spread your arms and getting your cut like so. So here again, kind of particularly interesting, or useful I should say, in areas where you're running through the wood. For me, it has some limitations. That's why I generally prefer to do this. It's maybe a little bit slower at times, but I can sneak through and make really effective cuts. So again, this way here. So you're kind of using your shoulders and your arms to make those cuts. Okay. All right, kind of the last grip I think that's worth knowing about would be, it's cutting kind of towards your thumb. Okay, so that it's kind of the exception to the rule that I pointed out earlier about carving towards your hand. It's that kind of grip that, I always think about how my dad would cut up strawberries for my cereal when I was little. And it's a cut going towards the thumb of your carving hand here. And I really don't use this cut very much. If you can avoid it, you probably should. But the way really to kind of do it safely is to have your thumb below the surface that you're carving. So here it's kind of below the plane on which I'm carving. I've moved the knife so that it's really held kind of way out in my fingertips here, so that as I rotate through, you can see there's actually like a real rotation. I'm not driving towards my thumb with the cut. I'm rotating through the cut and up out of it. Okay. So for me, this is oftentimes useful when I'm defining the rim of the bowl. Okay, so let's see. And also making small cuts here is helpful too. You can see too, I just naturally start to use my non-dominant hand to push through. This is the way that I would typically cut, in this direction. But having that thumb there is helpful. I'll use it also a lot of the time when I'm trying to cut across the bowl here, like so. And this grip is really, it's the way that I'm going to use my hook knife as well, cutting towards my thumb, but rotating through that cut. So a couple of things to be careful of when you are making these cuts. One is having those uncontrolled cuts, of course, for your own safety, but also because it's going to start to damage your spoon. So again, if you smash down into the bowl of the spoon here, you're going to have to carve away in the bowl so that you remove any material that might have been damaged. Otherwise, a crack will appear. Okay, so being sensitive as you're getting into the neck of the spoon there, taking your time in that area. The place where I oftentimes see people struggle and being a little too aggressive is coming down into the neck of the spoon here from kind of the high point to the low point. What happens is people come in aggressively, they cut through this area, chop, chop, chop. And then these fibers that are running long ways through the handle, they're severed right there and they're damaged. So the only way to remove them is to continue carving, and you end up with a spoon that has a very narrow neck. And sometimes that is used visually. It's oftentimes going to be a little bit narrower here, but it'll be wide in this direction for aesthetics and for strength. But this is really the point where people oftentimes struggle, and I've seen people even cut right through and break the handle right off their spoon. So they're kind of oftentimes using that thumb lever grip. That's one of my favorites. They're coming through, but if you just smack uncontrolled into this area, you're going to have a lot of material to remove. So taking small cuts and also sometimes rolling that cut through is going to help out a lot. In this area, this is again one of the key areas where I don't want to be cutting through a really thick, wide plane here because I'm using more power and it becomes less predictable. So what I'm going to do there is I'm going to knock down the corners first. So here and here. And I'll do that again typically with my thumb lever. I can get a lot of power cutting like this. And oftentimes I'll take that cut and continue into the handle of the spoon. I'm going to just free these chips up a little bit. And you can see that, I'm constantly flipping this thing around. This particular blank is a little bit less predictable than I was hoping for. So it's going to take a little bit of switching around, but that's natural. If it's not working, if it's splitting out, something's wrong, try flipping around, try to get the cut to actually behave the way that you want it to. Okay, so I'm going to reduce down that area there. And then once there's, a significant amount of material removed here, you can see I've kind of probably reduced this plane by about half. Then I can more easily and more controllably cut through this area. Okay, so I can do I'm still using my non-dominant hand here to kind of push through, but I don't have a tremendous amount of control. Oftentimes I'll do the thumb lever here, and even sometimes you can use that blade length to your advantage by kind of cutting towards the tip and rotating out of the cut so that you're not cutting right into the handle again. The other thing that happens a lot here is that people create a transition. They create a transition here that it's too sharp. You can see this curve is relatively delicate. Rather than cutting sharply in here, kind of rounding it right into the bowl, by having a nice subtle curve, you don't struggle so much where you're chasing the grain in one direction or the other. And also those cuts that are kind of a sharper angle in here, they're going to be harder to clean up and just less predictable. So I really encourage folks to create kind of a longer curve here, even a bit of an exaggerated curve. And I'll show you. I have some spoons that kind of demonstrate that. This is a spoon by Pat Diet, and you can see, it's a beautiful spoon, really. I mean, he's exceptional, but you can see that curve maybe a little better against my shirt here. It is relatively delicate as it comes through, and that makes transitioning much easier. So he gets to a point right about in here where the cut needs to stop and the other cut begins. If you come in too sharply, you're just going to be chopping through the fibers of the wood, and that's going to cause problems. You can see here this is one that's a little bit sharper, and it does become a little bit more difficult. So something to keep in mind, try to make that smooth. Oftentimes it starts to get sharp because you are cutting in over and over again, and you need to keep chasing that line backwards. So be careful, try to create controlled cuts. That's really key when you're carving the spoon. I'm going to show you now how to carve the bowl of the spoon using your hook knife. This again is the Mora 164, great little knife, and it's very effective for removing material from the bowl of your spoon. Typically I do this after I've done almost all of the carving of the handle and the shape of the bowl. I find it easier just to kind of design the bowl around those other features. Okay, so this piece obviously I haven't carved, but I think it's going to be a little bit easier to see what I'm actually doing with the knife. So using this, I think there's kind of two different philosophies to using the hook knife. One I would describe as working across the grain. Okay, so grain's running this way, so across the grain is this way. Oftentimes it's at a 45 degree. And you might know from other wood carving, when you work across the grain, it usually takes little effort because you're severing the fibers that are running through the wood, and it kind of peels the pieces up real rapidly, but it oftentimes doesn't leave a great finish. Okay, so the other way to do it would be going with the grain. So that would be making a cut, typically going from the front of the bowl towards the middle. But at a certain point here, and you'll encounter this either way you are working the knife, there's a transition in the grain, and it's happening. Here we've created quite a bit of predictability by having that kind of shelf there. So that's basically where we're going to have that transition. So it's particularly important if you are working with the grain that you're aware of that and you don't work it too far, or you're going to start to split into kind of the back of the bowl and into the handle, and it's going to weaken the bowl. So kind of working in a way where you cut through a couple of layers, remove the wood, kind of check your progress. That's how I would work going with the grain. Typically I do rough the spoon out, working across the grain, and then I'll usually come through and kind of clean up the piece by working with the grain. Okay, so really with both of these cuts, well, especially with across the grain, I do make a cut that comes towards my thumb. And of course this can be dangerous. Certainly, if you're starting out and you want to use like a chef's glove, that's a great, extra precaution. The first time I used a hook knife, I opened up the brand new package and I just cut right into my thumb. Really didn't know what was going on. So be careful. But the way to do this safely and effectively is to hold the hook knife. You hold it kind of high up in your fingers, like so. It's not buried in the palm of your hand. It's kind of far up, like so. Okay, so you hold it securely up there. And this allows kind of a full range of motion that takes the knife up and away from your thumb as you're rotating. Okay, so I kind of anchor my thumb on the opposite side of the bowl. And carve like so. Okay, so there it is, kind of in its most basic version. I oftentimes kind of supplement this cut by adding my left hand, my non-dominant hand. So what I'm doing there is I'm pushing with the fingers of my non-dominant hand. See what I'm doing there? Pushing here. And by doing so, it allows me to kind of, once again, stop short. The motion is rather controlled, and I reach the end of the stroke here, and all motion stops. Okay? It also provides a little bit of extra power as I'm cutting through. So you can see where I'm working here. I'm kind of working in the, front area a little bit. And as I'm getting deeper down into the bowl, I want to be sure that I'm also taking material out of this area on the far side, because if I descend too far down and then I start to come up out of my cut, that's going to pull the fibers apart once again, and I'm going to run into areas that are going to be damaged. So here I might want to just spend a little extra time. Okay. But really, I do want to work these cuts all the way across the bowl. I'm going to also do this cut up here. And you can see this is a way to get that thumb out of the way. I'm kind of moving back on the knife a little bit. Up here, I'm really choked up. You can see there. Here I move back a little bit, and I'm using my non-dominant hand once again to drive the workpiece. So here I have absolutely nothing that I can hit. The palm of my hand is well below the surface of the spoon. So this is what I'm going to use, especially up in these areas in the front here. Typically this is a little bit of a shorter stroke. And you can see here now I'm starting to actually work with the grain. Because if I work across the grain here, it's very likely that I'm going to just cut into the far shoulder and damage the piece. I can get in there and kind of rotate up, working across the grain, but generally I'll start to work it down with the grain, kind of pivoting, kind of in a variation of the thumb lever grip, so kind of pivoting down in. Here too, this is kind of the point where if I am descending too quickly, it starts to bind up. You can see the curls there. We start to bind up, and if I continue, I'm going to just split through the wood. So oftentimes you'll kind of accumulate, let's see if I can, accumulate a bunch of curls, and then you'll come back through and get those out of there by working across the grain. So for me, it's always really a combination of the two. For other people, you know, different things are going to work. I think what works safely is usually what's appropriate. So just to continue, you can see how I'm working it down through. Getting fairly deep down here. Going to free that out like so. I might come through in this area. You can see with this cut, for me it's requiring a lot less effort. This is again across the grain. I'm taking much bigger curls. It really, I think, is much more efficient, so that's generally how I'm going to do most of the rough shaping of the bowl. I can also do this in the opposite direction. So I've been cutting with the handle facing kind of past my body. Here it'll be facing out. So I can do this to cut some of this out. But I need to be careful with these cuts too, because I don't want to smack, again, right into the opposite side of the bowl. And that's again why oftentimes I'll switch to this grip, where I have a lot of control and I can come down through. So I'm reaching a point right down in this area where that grain is switching direction. I find in this spot, working across the grain, you're almost always going to just be pulling the fibers apart. So I'll usually work down, I'll work it across, and then I'll kind of come in and really take just these very delicate cuts to get that cleaned out. Okay. So as you're making these cuts, of course, keep an eye on how deep you're actually going. One thing I see a lot with beginners and where they'll oftentimes struggle is that they are a little overzealous with digging out the bowl, and they will create a bowl that, well, sometimes people will go right through the bottom, but it'll be too deep. And if you consider like a normal metal spoon that you're used to using, it's really not a big, deep spoon. It's not a ladle. It doesn't have a big bowl. It's relatively shallow, and that's really the most practical thing. If you have a super deep bowl, you end up needing to like tip it forward crazily, or use some sort of wild tongue action to get the contents of your spoon out of there. So unless it's a specialty spoon like a measuring spoon or a ladle, I recommend sticking with something that's a little bit shallower. This too is intended to be a cooking spoon, and with a cooking spoon, mostly what I'm doing is stirring and scraping. I don't need a really deep bowl, and oftentimes it benefits me to have a more shallow bowl as well. So don't go super crazy if you are working on that cooking spoon. In the case of this spoon shape here, I've cut it so that it's just straight across. This would be kind of a good ambidextrous cooking spoon. But usually what I will do is descend in one direction or the other, so that for a right-handed person like myself, as I'm stirring, in my pot, I'm working, I guess it would be counterclockwise, which is more natural. It's kind of the forehand of cooking, versus working this way, which really is kind of unnatural feeling. So this would actually be the left-handed spoon. You can see if I'm cooking as a right-hander the way I normally would, I'd be working just on the tip there. So I'll swap this around. So for students, I oftentimes go with this flat design, which is something you could stick with, or you can choose to, when you're using your Sloyd knife, really, descend in one direction to create a nice flat plane on which to kind of scrape. Okay? All right, so with the spoon knife, just take your time. You might not get these big shavings like I'm getting, and you shouldn't if you're beginning, because using all that force, that extra force, introduces unpredictability, and you really don't want to have that when you're beginning. So rotating through, kind of always working down through the grain. You don't want to start coming up out, because that's where you're going to tear out material.